You are listening to the e-flux podcast.
Hello and welcome back to the e-flux podcast. Amidst the current climate of uncertainty and social distancing due to COVID-19, we are continuing to record remotely. Today's episode is a conversation between Elvia Wilk and artist Anicka Yi.
I'm Elvia Wilk, and I'm here in my living room talking to the artist Anicka Yi. We are having a conversation over an app from our respective homes because we're quarantined in different parts of New York City. It's a strange time, and it's also a really prescient one to talk to Anicka about her work, so I'm really excited to have her here. Anicka, the original occasion for our conversation was the announcement a few weeks ago that you were chosen for this year's Tate Modern Turbine Hall commission. So that news is a bright spot among the rest, and I wanted to say congratulations, first of all, and thanks for speaking to me.
Thank you so much, and thank you for inviting me to pollute your airways.
It's the right time. Everyone needs content right now. So we were obviously planning on having this conversation in person, and the framing of it is just so indicative of the way that everyone is feeling right now, which is super estranged and super connected at the same time. And I have that feeling every day of this kind of weird push and pull between being really aware of global systems and the way we're all connected, and also just feeling so isolated.
Mm-hmm.
And this has given me a lot to think about in terms of your work when preparing for our conversation. So I'm hoping we can talk about some of the broader concerns that you've brought up over the years when it comes to thinking about what defines us as human and what our interactions with other species, let's say technological and organic and otherwise, might be, and the way that ecosystems tie us all together. And then, I'd like to talk through some specific works and maybe end with how the COVID-19 moment is modifying or shaping your approach. When it comes to the Turbine Hall Commission, I know a lot of what you're thinking about is human-machine interaction and the idea of artificial physical intelligence. Could you explain what artificial physical intelligence means?
Sure. Initially, I wanted to convert Turbine Hall into an aquarium of machines. I was thinking about this in, like a kind of natural history of machines or an aquarium of machines, and thinking about how we can break this kind of dichotomy between the machine and the human, as and kind of liberating the idea of machines as these kind of factory slave muscle to the human. And I wanted to identify and exhibit the philosophical and poetic potential of machines. And how do I do that? I kind of introduced this concept of a biologized machine with my installations at the Venice Biennale last year. And I wanted to keep that or translate that onto the Turbine Hall project. And I wanted to reframe machines as intelligent creatures with unique sensory understanding of the world, with a tacit knowledge and embodied intelligence. So I just, having not really worked with artificial intelligence in such a robust way, there was a lot of research that I wanted to do, and just how to approach machine in the way that I felt pertinent and urgent. And I feel like one way is that so far we haven't really explored a machine sensorium or a machine microbiome, all that would fall under the rubric of an artificial physical intelligence. And so a physical intelligence is an intelligence of the body and sensorium. And so much of biological life, we experience and perceive reality through our sensorium. And the rich intelligence that comes from the body is largely missing in machine learning discourse. And it often relies too much on abstract, disembodied notions of pure cognition, which is essentially another way of saying this sort of brain in a vat cognition. And that's conventionally known as artificial general intelligence, or AGI for short. So, what I would like to propose with my installation at Turbine Hall is to sort of posit machines in the world, like other biological living entities, relating and responding through our particular machine body and sensorium. And so that is essentially what I would consider artificial physical intelligence. API is another way of thinking about it, and that intelligence emerges from being a body in the world and co-evolving with other life forms from the senses, the cells, and the microbiome.
Right. I think it's fascinating that our understanding of the human body's porosity and our I guess, being a part of ecosystems bigger than us and also having ecosystems inside of us, that this kind of set of realizations has occurred before a set of realizations about machines similarly existing in ecosystems and containing worlds within them. And I'm wondering a lot when working through these ideas of machines that might learn sensorially or whose cognition might work more like an organism's, which of course they would, how we avoid anthropomorphizing the machines and thinking of them just trying to continue to create them in a human image, whereas the Turing test idea is an idea of a disembodied intelligence, this machine that could answer questions or compute, but that's a kind of mirroring of the way that we think or maybe want the human mind to work. So when thinking of machines with bodies, how can we allow them to be different from humans with bodies, and how can we avoid repeating those same anthropocentric mistakes?
Right. Well, it's challenging. I can tell you that much. This. It's been very challenging. One of the biggest challenges that my team is working through is how to integrate the human while not capitulating to this kind of human exceptionalism and this kind of human hubris, at the core of this. And one way to navigate this is how do we figure the human once the machine ceases to be the other of the human. All of this distinction of the natural and the artificial, it tends to kind of disintegrate when we think about machines and how humans are not the sort of like the non-machine and the non-nature. So what I'm proposing is that biologizing machines is not about making machines similar to humans, but it's about endowing them with the necessary tools to evolve as their own species and to hopefully biologically harmonize. And so I guess like what my hope or goal with this project is to kind of create a wilding process for these machines and to let them live free and independent from humans to the extent that they can, and to liberate these machines and to allow them to develop their own forms of being and knowing. And they shouldn't be limited to narrow anthropocentric ideas of intelligence. So I guess what I'm trying to propose is that a biologized machine is neither a dystopian or utopian entity. It's neither our friend nor our foe. It's just something really radically unknown, kind of like an alien life form. And that's the kind of approach that I'm taking to avoid any kind of, sort of anthropomorphizing or overbearing anthropogenic approach.
You can't see me right now, but I'm nodding to what you're saying. Just to affirm that that's what's happening on my end. Um, I think, well, maybe it's a good time to mention that you and I are both part of a project called Transformations of the Human, which is part of the Berggruen Institute, an independent think tank based in Los Angeles. And the reason I bring this up, besides the fact that it has created a platform from which our conversations are springing, a kind of common philosophical ground led by Tobias Rees, who was a previous podcast guest, in fact. I suppose that program provides a nice way of thinking laterally from both, the way that thinking about biologized machines can be non-anthropomorphized. If we do that, it demands that we also think of non-human species in that way. So if we can start to think of machines as fully other, then we could maybe also think of animals and plants and microbes in that way. And not to force the connections or make too much of a stretch, but the virus is actually a really fascinating figure here. And I know that those of us who are part of the Berggruen project are kind of seized by this moment in which so many people across fields are focusing on the virus as, curiously, it's a biological entity, but viruses function in strange ways like machines. And the virus as a figure philosophically has often offered a point in which to think about how the substrates of our existence are neither organic nor machinic, and that it breaks down on the level of the microbial. I wonder if the virus in particular is sort of forcing a broad approach from all of us, where we can no longer think of ourselves as independent entities, which is, I think, something your work has been positing for a long time. But what's so curious about the virus is that the way it separates and unites us, and the way that it seems to function like a machine and an enemy. And I wonder how we can think about the virus as less of a separate anti-human enemy kind of machinic invader or alien invader, and something that is, of course, what we and our ecosystems produced and created.
Well, I don't know about you, but I've had to do a very deep crash course into viruses since this entire kind of crisis has arrived here and impacted us. And to be honest, I didn't know that much about viruses and how they functioned and what their role is in all of these sort of ecosystems. And what I've learned, for one thing, is that viruses, while not technically alive, they're part of a living system. They're part of an engine, and this really kind of got me thinking about what constitutes life, what could be life, and it's not so simple to think and designate that one sort of biological entity or agent qualifies as living and another isn't, when it's all very kind of entangled. And one way to think about this is that viruses, they can pass through cellular membranes, they can pass through organisms, and they can pass through oceans. And in that sense, it defies the ideas of these self-contained bodies and species and territories. The virus deconstructs boundaries between categories, and they just sort of, they do this thing that I think is such a strong philosophical motif for my practice, which is leaking. They demonstrate the inescapability of the leaks and flows across bodies of knowledge and bodies of matter. And so I'm really fascinated by that. And this has really expanded my thinking, even up to my practice that has been engaged with multi-species interdependence and this kind of entanglement and this exchange, this flow of exchange that all living sort of agents are participating in. But the virus is really something that kind of expands this notion for me in a recent way. And it tells me that this kind of instability, this multiplicity, it contradicts our human traditional models of what a body is, and as a simple sort of site of objective intervention. And so I think, like our leaking bodies, as it were, it resists this kind of, let's say, normalization, demanding some kind of understanding of an entire person and system that constitutes their well-being in the world. So it's very complex. And I think it helps to think about these kinds of assembled ecologies or ecosystems. And I think that I'm still trying to process and learn about how viruses function, that they can simultaneously be mutualistic in benefit They can be very good for hosts, but they can also be very bad. And so I think that it seems like we don't know a ton about viruses. That's the other thing. We're just starting to learn. But one thing is for sure that the human genome contains 8% virus. It's embedded in our DNA, and these are things that are really questioning and reframing what we know about biology, but also about the immune system, for example.
Yeah, I think it's fascinating this recent trend towards like probiotics and, not over sanitizing our environments and thinking of, being dirtier in order to build our immune systems, and this increasing awareness that cleanliness and hygiene have backfired. And now suddenly we're in the midst of this moment when we have no choice but to over sanitize and do the opposite. And it feels like we really struggle to find a middle ground where the external world is neither the enemy or sort of like fetishized and romanticized as like a healthy thing, getting back to nature and taking probiotics, but also not this sort of like scary invader. I think what is so strange also is that these invisible microbes and aspects of our bodies and our lives are becoming visible right now. And they're becoming visible through the symptoms of illnesses in humans, and also forcing structures like the hospital system, the healthcare system, the insurance industry, all of these systems, everything suddenly is becoming very, very visible. It's been visible always, depending on who's looking and where you're looking,
Mhm.
but suddenly we're forced to really see some things. And I think the symptom is a really interesting way to think about it. And I've been curious in ways that your work operates in not so much revealing the hidden, but allowing the human to encounter the invisible beings and elements and also systems that we can't actually sense
Mhm.
on the level of sight or touch or smell.
Mhm.
And I was thinking we could talk through some of your works with that in mind. Maybe part of your installation in Venice that you talked about or referred to briefly earlier, you had a two-part piece called Biologizing the Machine, and one part was called Tentacular Trouble, and the other Terra Incognita.
Mhm.
The Terra Incognita piece I find fascinating because of the way it makes visible a lot of the processes of the non-human world and tries to give them a visual and aesthetic form. It's not a data visualization, but it does something in that it allows us to understand through transmission of information. Could you describe the piece, actually just the nuts and bolts of it, so that we could talk about it a bit?
Sure. So I, along with a biologist from New York, Frank Cusimano, and my studio manager, Riley Duncan, I sent them to Venice a couple months ahead of the opening to dig up buckets and buckets of terroir or earth, and in the surrounding area near the Venice Biennale. I was interested in the data, the rich soil material, and we dug up, I don't know, something like 30, 40 pounds of dirt and mud from the surrounding area. And then we filled them into these plexiglass vitrines, and then there were these sort of sensors that were installed in these vitrines that were also connected to a software algorithm that was designed to detect these different sort of smells that the bacteria in the soil and the mud were transmitting. So the idea was I wanted to teach the AI, sorry, the algorithm about smell through the microbes that were living in the mud. And so they were kind of growing consistently throughout the run of the exhibition of the Biennale. And the algorithms were able to, throughout that period, I think it was that for 4 months or something, 6 months, I can't remember how long the show was for, but the goal was to teach the algorithm about these different sort of odors and these different spikes of extremities of these different kinds of odors, especially as the microbes were growing and as they were starting to mature as well in terms of aroma and proliferation.
And the way that this was manifested to the viewer was this like cross section of soil sandwiched between glass, I think, with the computing element visible among the soil as a kind of landscape. So this computing process, which was, yes, learning from this organic process, was translated in a visual form to the viewer.
Mm-hmm.
And I'm curious, I guess what I'm getting at is, the relationship between, the difference between data visualization and an artistic intervention and aesthetic presentation of a process that's not aimed at explaining in the same sense.
Right. So I wanted to create, I guess, some kind of experience of this entanglement between the microbes, the mud, the soil, and the sort of the machine component of the sensors and also the framing with the vitrine and all of that, and create this kind of intersection where these different kinds of intelligence might meet but also learn from each other and also create this sort of symbiotic experience to be able to witness it and then also be able to sort of see through this kind of temporality as it starts to visually as well, that the human visitor could detect this growth pattern through variations on pigmentation of the soil that is being controlled by the bacteria. The bacteria is creating the pigmentation. So you had these broad strokes of ochre and green, hunter green and crimson. And so then it became like sort of like abstract gestures of pigmentation and this kind of shift and cracks in the mud through gravity and through pressure. And so I mean, formally speaking, it had all the hallmarks of, let's say, like an abstract painting or something. But then there was a lot of data that is being processed within that plate, within that vitrine. And so there's a sort of like multiple systems at play there.
One thing I love about that work is that it's for us, but it's also not for us. It's also for the AI that's learning to smell,
Mhm.
which brings us back to this idea of artificial physical intelligence and what it might mean for machines to experience the world sensorially. It makes me wonder a lot about what art by machines and for machines might be, in the same way that I think a lot about what writing might be that is not for us, because most of the text generated in the world right now is written by computers and will only ever be read by other computers. It may have originated in a human moment of creation, but it's certainly a different kind of communication, which is simply not for us. So this kind of inaccessibility, but also preserving the fact that, part of this ecosystem you've created for the machine to learn something, I think it's really provocative. And I wonder in particular about the sense of smell in that work, in relation to the machine smelling, but that has been a central element through a lot of your work over the years. You've done a lot of projects which make the gallery space or the exhibition space infused with smells. One of them, the smell of a memory of a particular meal for you. Another one, a smell that I guess emerged from the combined bacteria from 100 women. And also very recently, a project you did at Dover Street Market, which was to make a series of scents or perfumes, one of which I wear very happily every day, especially now that I'm in my home to have some company. And they are named after, each of the scents is named after a woman, a historical figure, or a future imaginary So there's a very obvious set of connections here between bodies and their identity markers like gender and class, and scent and smell, and also smell as a kind of communication that is not codified, that we don't think of communication as communication very often because it's passive and because it doesn't fit neatly into the rubric of visual or textual transmission. And it's hard to preserve, it's hard to bottle, it has a different association with everyone. Could you talk a bit about your original, I guess your first smell projects, and where this fascination with smell emerged? Because I assume it didn't come from, I wonder if I could make a robotic smelling machine. It probably came from a place of memory and the experience of scent. Is that right?
I think most humans are wired that way, whether we recognize it or not. So yes, it did come from this kind of subconscious place that was inherently learned, which is not necessarily a good thing. Uh, but so the early scent works that I was first engaged with, a friend of mine who's a fashion designer was putting together a presentation for Fashion Week. And in lieu of a fashion show, like a runway show, she put together a presentation and she created a conceptual department store. And she had a kind of perfume counter, so to speak. And she asked me to create some fragrances for this conceptual perfume counter. Having never worked with perfume, I said, "Sure, of course, yeah, I can do that." And I consulted the internet, and I consulted a friend who worked for Givaudan at the time, which is a fragrance and flavors kind of company that creates probably half the flavors and fragrances that we experience in the world. And so I just set about to go through my kitchen cabinets and try to make these tinctures with alcohol, and I just sort of macerated different sort of spices and scents. And in a few weeks later, I used these tinctures to create an all natural scent, so to speak. All natural meaning that there were no synthetic chemical aromas involved. It was just whatever I had that was the actual material substrate itself, that was being macerated into a high proof alcohol. Where did this come from? This impulse, this desire. I think that largely it was something that was just so intimate and immediate. And yes, as you suggested, smell is a tool of human communication. It's communicating bodily knowledge essentially. And I think that on a subconscious level, that was sort of where I was looking, where I thought, okay, how can I speak to this kind of bodily information, this bodily knowledge? But another approach is that it was immaterial, that you couldn't see it, and to some degree our senses are they're ordered in various ways, whether it's class or gender or ethnicity. And so I thought that it was interesting how sight is usually attributed to the masculine because we associate it with discovery, knowledge, and something that we can approach from a distance. And whereas our sense of smell has been given a feminine attribute, because it is immaterial, it is hard to describe and hard to talk about, inscrutable. And I don't accept those categories or those descriptions. And yet, it's a way to talk about how smell is a site for political, social, biological discourse. And so I just felt that this was a very, very potent, rich area in thinking about making work. But also, it's a way, I think it was my kind of rebellious kind of reaction against the kind of masculine, monumental work that I was conditioned by, and that this work should sort of will last forever, and it will outlast us humans, and this will be this kind of relic, some kind of legacy of humanity. And I guess on some level, I was really questioning that, and to some extent rejecting it. And to me, I felt that was a very potent sort of area to start thinking about art. But in the beginning, people really didn't, or challenged, I didn't think that was art, what I was trying to say with smell, and rejecting it as not art. But I didn't really feel compelled to defend it as art. So that wasn't really an issue for me.
I think what you say about legacy is especially, it feels urgent right now to think about what legacy means. Art can help us think about that. It's only one way of thinking about legacy. I know you have an interest in preservation as a concept and as a method, thinking about how art works in the most literal sense, how art works maybe with organic components or non-stable components, or non-traditional archival means can be preserved or archived or cataloged or saved or created as part of an artistic legacy. And I think right now I am asking those questions on a broader scale in terms of what humanity's legacy might be. Not to get too dire and say we're about to be gone completely. I think we're persisting in various forms. But I do wonder about the ideas of conservation, preservation, lineage that are evident in a lot of your work, and what you think in terms of when you make things that may or may not be able to be preserved according to standard means, and how that plays into larger systems of preservation.
It's a spectrum. I think it's a real spectrum. And I think that it's very difficult to try to have this kind of tidy notion of what is preservable, what isn't. And from very early on in my practice, I was engaged in conversations with conservators at museums and institutions, sort of like being summoned to the principal's office because I was being, rebellious or difficult or something. And we would just have these very long conversations, and I guess I never really quite accepted that something would just be archival, and that we could just, it would just last to the end of time or something. I never really quite embraced that idea, mostly because my foray or entry into art making and art thinking is really predicated on a transcorporeal exchange, because that's what smell is. You walk in to experience an olfaction work of mine. It means that you are engaging in a kind of exchange and a kind of contract here, where you take in these scent molecules, and the work gets partly activated by the biological entity that is in the room, that's there to experience it, whether it's the spider in the corner of the floor, or whether it's the microbes, whether it's the gut sensors on the human visitor. That's experiencing this. So there's this exchange that's taking place, and I think that air is also a really, really important sort of concept for thinking about olfaction art. I think air is the site. I mean, it's the atmosphere that we're all in, and I think it's especially pertinent to think about right now in the climate that we're in, because we're all mandated to practice social distancing or enforce solidarity, as I prefer to think of it. But everyone's deeply concerned about airborne exchange, and I think that air is so important to foreground as a medium for art, as a medium for my art, and as a site for this kind of discourse. Like, who gets to breathe the good air? Who produces the worst air? I mean, the 1% definitely contributes to producing the most polluted toxic air, and it's historically the underclass that have had to suffer with the toxic, polluted, miasmic air. And so I think that there's a lot to be sort of discovered with air as a medium. And so I think that this moment, where we're having to rethink everything, in our relationship to microbes, to virus, to machines. This is essentially a way for our species to get reset. That's how I experienced this quarantine period, and moving forward, in this era of COVID-19. It's like our species is asking for a massive reset. That's how I'm interpreting this. And how do we do that? The way we do that is we have to rethink what the human is. And, the work that you, Elvia and Tobias and I and the other fellows in the Berggruen Institute, that has been our challenge the last 2 years, is to rethink what the human is, how to redefine the human, given the technological, given the biogeochemical sort of disruption that we're living through right now. And it's not enough to think that the human is not nature, that it's more than nature, and that it's the other of machine intelligence or something. We need a new definition. We need we need new tools in rethinking of who we are, because our old definitions, our old models are just disintegrating and they're not serving us. And it's creating a lot of fear and anxiety in everybody. And the best way that I know to move forward in all of this is to rethink through what is the self, first and foremost. If we are mostly comprised of microorganisms that we don't consider human, as trillions of bacteria and other microorganisms are in us, what does that mean to be an individual? What does it mean to be a self? There is no real sovereign self in the form of a human, especially when the human is mostly comprised of microbial matter. So that's one way of starting to rethink what the human is. But also now thinking about viruses and thinking about how viruses, that they're not alive and yet they're part of a living system, and that they can't metabolize and they can't reproduce on their own, yet they are clearly, now we're learning, important ecological actors, and that they participate in crucial food webs. They turn over almost half of the ocean's microscopic life, and so they can be considered as regulators of planetary biogeochemistry. So they're pretty critical in that role. And so lately, I've been thinking about the importance of non-living viruses and the need for our way of thinking of life in a different way, and one that distinguishes life in general from individual living things. So I think, especially in the West, we're very, very attached to this notion of an individuated living entity. And I think this virus is teaching us that that doesn't really exist, and we have to let go of that way of thinking. And this is a really ripe, important philosophical moment, and in trying to think of virus in a philosophical way, and that it's an interesting entity that can give insight into conceptual understanding of agents and activities of cooperation, and maybe, just maybe, we can rethink politics through the virus in this way, rethink politics, um, you know, in this way where it's not about the individual and it's about a collective body. It's about a collective condition. It's about thinking about politics embracing nature, thinking about politics through nature, as opposed to politics being scrubbed from nature, exempt from nature, as nature is not an out there, but it's an in here.
There's such an incredible opportunity here to think collectively. And I'm reminded, when thinking about how power works, and the systems of power that might need a quote reset, I'm reminded of an idea from Elizabeth Povinelli, the anthropologist, who says that today power functions not according to the ability to distinguish between life and death. So, not as the ability to kill simply, but as the ability to distinguish between life and not life. So, what counts as life at all in the first place? And she uses viruses to think through this idea of life versus non-life, because the virus challenges this dichotomy, because it's part of living systems, but we can't categorize it according to traditional definitions as exactly alive, as you say. And I am I agree that the virus as such offers a philosophical opportunity to think about how power has really been operating all along. And I also agree that thinking of like resituating the site or the medium from the material, tangible, hard matter, monumental um, like offerings to air and to atmosphere is really powerful. It allows us to think of how power functions in different non-material ways that have material effects on the world nonetheless. So someone else I've been reading is Emmanuel Cochia, who wrote a book called The Life of Plants, where he describes plants as atmosphere. They're completely contiguous with the environment because they create atmosphere and they create the conditions for all life in their breathing. And I find that both of these philosophical frameworks useful when thinking about art and thinking about politics. And I wanted to talk to you just a bit, sort of as we wind up, about how philosophical frameworks like the ones that are being developed in Transformations of the Human, which really encourages like true difficult discourse between artists and scientists and artists and engineers and artists and philosophers and writers like me. What role does this kind of philosophical pursuit play in the material production of your studio, and how is it mirrored in your studio practice?
Right. Well, I mean, I say that what we do is we do philosophy. That's what we do by a different means, and it's so essential for my team, my studio team, as well as my broader cross-disciplinary network. We collaborate with forensic chemists, we collaborate with perfumers, we collaborate with synthetic biologists, we collaborate with philosophers, we collaborate with so many different people, and we demonstrate how we have these entangled ecosystems between the disciplines. And so what we do is we do a lot of research. Um, when we approach a project or a subject, and we put a lot of research into learning about different sort of ideas and concepts, whether it's about xenobiota, or whether it's about uh, you know um, I don't know, just like how algae, the function of algae on the planet. We you know Prior to the Venice Biennale installation, with the sort of kelp laminated sculptures, that was a 2.5 year research project. We had to learn a lot about algae and learn that algae is the largest biomass on the planet, that it helps to that it is an alternative to fossil fuels in the form of biofuel, and is an alternative to plastic in the form of biopolymer. It is one of the biggest food sources on the planet. I mean, it's just this kind of miracle material. And if we were to maybe try to terraform Mars, maybe algae is the only thing that could be the thing to terraform. It Algae also predates bacteria, it seems. And so we do a lot of research. It's so important that we understand the ideas that we're trying to tackle. And I wouldn't say that we're necessarily having PhDs on every subject like algae or something, but it's pretty important that we have a very deep, robust understanding of not only the ideas but also the materials that we introduce into the studio. When we worked with the algae, we consulted conservators like Christian Scheidemann, who has a studio in the city, but we also consulted MIT biopolymer chemist. We also sent samples of algae to a laboratory in Cambridge, Massachusetts, and we did tensile strength. We did, accelerated aging tests, and so we really just try to tackle it from lots of different angles, and not just a kind of intellectual, philosophical one, but also from a kind of laboratory exhaustive testing experimentation as well.
I think your use of the word we to describe your studio practice is really important. And I don't want to harp too much on the way that you produce works as a collective studio, because, of course, artistic practice has always been a collective effort, whether or not it's recognized as such. But I find that the way you go about it, in an explicit way, and in a way that is so inclusive, is really unique. And so I don't want to gloss over the fact that your studio is a multi-person operation, and it's also a multi-species operation, and that each time you talk about a work like the smell work that you made early on, you say, well, the first thing I did was I consulted a friend. And I think this aspect of kind of continually questioning, reaching beyond your own skill set or your own knowledge boundaries, is a particular model of practice that can offer a lot about resilience in the face of challenges like the world is facing right now, and kind of trying to preserve working models that are going to be more flexible and more tensile and more quickly reactive as we learn more and as things move in what feel like really fast, uncontrollable ways. So I just want to end by asking how your studio practice is persisting at the moment, despite the the remoteness of it all, and how you're able to use this moment to think about we in terms of your studio, in terms of all of your collaborators, but also we in a really planetary sense.
Yeah, that's a wonderful closing question, Elvia, and very poignant. I, I think that this kind of notion of this subjectivity of the artist is deeply problematic for me. I think it's an impediment and unrealistic, as you pointed out, because most artists do work in a collective sense, whether it's recognized or not. And I think I just kind of wanted to just shed and dissolve my subjectivity as this kind of I, me, sort of agent, and recognizing that I myself and what constitutes who I am as Anicka Yi is a consortium of lots of other entities and organisms. So it seems very just completely necessary to just even consider myself in this kind of we sort of context, and then to extend that to my broader studio network. We are, an army of we's, right? And we are currently working remotely through different, sort of platforms, whether it's Zoom or Skype or FaceTime or what have you. But most importantly, we've had to adapt. You can't just take whatever sort of biorhythms that you inhabit with a collective IRL studio experience and think that that's going to just magically sort of snap into place when you're all distributed along 3 or 4 different boroughs or different state lines and what have you, or country, international borders at that. And so I think we're having to adapt and find new ways of communicating and working together, which I wouldn't say is all that seamless. We have to create new modalities and new methodologies of communicating, even just on a flat screen. You look at 5 other faces on a Zoom call, and you're feeling a little bit like you're doing stand up or something, in front of like these sort of blank board faces or something. And so like we all have to kind of, strive to accommodate this new sort of way of communicating and working together. But I think that also there's a lot of sort of room for improvisation and a lot of room for creating and building off of this kind of how would I say, like kind of a hyper data flow, hyper sort of collaboration, where you're building on documents that you're just passing around, and you're just like writing on top of a document, and then you pass it on to the next person. And so I think that that's been really helpful. But also, I mean, never have I spoken so in depth to so many people in my life, in my entire life, have gotten so deep tissue and granular. And so it reframes intimacy. I think, we're experiencing these different kinds of forms of intimacy, whether it's through, these kinds of like, Zoom calls with people, and people you've known for 20 years, and you've never seen the interior of their apartments or their homes. And so there's that level of intimacy, and the different kinds of access that we have, that we don't seem to have these kind of like 9 to 5 borders anymore. I mean, we're all kind of just sort of doing so much emotional, creative labor. I mean, it's on overdrive at the moment, to be able to check in with our community, with our constituents, and what have you. So I think the wonderful thing that my studio has told me, their feedback is that, when all of this started happening, and we've had learned about the COVID-19, it wasn't so alarming to everybody, because we'd been immersed and really sort of like deeply meditating on these ideas for years. And so to think about this kind of entanglement, this kind of interdependency on living life, this is something that we are all quite well prepared for and well conditioned for. So that made me very happy that we're kind of these sort of first responders on an intellectual crisis, and we're being there for each other and trying to sort of be there for others. So that makes me feel very optimistic.
I also would like to feel optimistic, and for that reason, I'm glad to have spoken to you. I agree that the moment offers an incredible opportunity for intimacy, and it also just demands a lot of creativity from all of us. So thank you for your creativity, and I really enjoyed having you as my social encounter of the day.
Thank you so much. And these were really wonderful, thoughtful questions. And thanks for having me.